The pine needles clawed at her ankles, 1,000 tiny barbs punishing her for a crime she hadn't yet committed. Flight. The word was a frantic heartbeat in Alara's chest, a frantic pumping of her legs through the unforgiving undergrowth of the northern woods. The ceremonial dress, a thing of pale silk and wishful thinking, was now a tattered ruin, snagged and torn by the very wilderness that was saving her. Each rip was a small victory, a severing of the tie to the life she was supposed to accept with a bowed head and a grateful heart. Grateful. The thought was so bitter, it almost made her gag. She was supposed to be grateful that Brannock, alpha of the Black River Pack, had chosen her. Him, with his swaggering cruelty and hands that were always too tight on the arms of she-wolves who displeased him. The elders had called it a great honor. Her father had called it a necessity, his eyes skating away from hers, unable to meet the quiet desperation he saw there. They saw an Omega, a pawn to be traded for alliance and stability. They didn't see her. They never had. A memory, sharp and cruel, lanced through her exhaustion. The great hall choked with the scent of pine incense and roasting meat. The entire pack gathered, their faces a blur of expectation. Brannock stood before the hearthstone, broad and smug, his chest puffed out with the certainty of a male who had never been denied a thing in his life. He called her forward. "Alara of Stone Creek," he'd boomed, his voice a gravelly assertion of ownership. "Come forth and accept my mark. You will be my mate, bear my heirs, and bring honor to your lineage." It wasn't a proposal. It was a verdict. Her feet had felt like lead, but she'd moved, drawn forward by the weight of 1,000 expectant eyes. She'd reached the stone, its ancient surface warm beneath her trembling fingers. All she had to do was nod, just nod, and her life would be over, replaced by a half-life of service to a male she despised. She'd looked at him, really looked at him, and seen the glint of possession in his eyes. He wasn't choosing a partner. He was acquiring a prize. And in that moment, a tiny, defiant spark that had been banked low for years flared into a desperate flame. "No," she had whispered. The word was so quiet, it was almost lost in the crackling of the fire. But Brannock heard it. A flicker of disbelief crossed his face, followed by a dark flush of rage. "What did you say, little mouse?" he'd snarled, his affable mask dissolving. She'd gathered every scrap of her courage. "I said no. I will not be your mate." The silence that followed was absolute, a crushing weight that stole the air from her lungs. Then came the laughter. It started with Brannock, a harsh, ugly sound. It spread through his cronies, then the rest of the pack, a wave of mockery that washed over her, stripping her bare. They laughed at the absurdity of it. An Omega, a nobody, refusing an alpha. "Her will is of no consequence," Brannock had announced to the crowd, dismissing her with a wave of his hand as if she were a pestering fly. "The union is decreed. She will be brought to my chambers tonight. She will learn her place." That was when she ran. She didn't think. She just turned and fled, pushing through the stunned crowd, ignoring her father's shocked cry of her name. She ran out of the hall, out of the settlement, and into the one place she'd always felt a sliver of peace, the woods. Now, hours later, with her lungs burning and her muscles screaming, she stumbled into a clearing. And there it was, a cabin. Small, made of dark, weathered logs, nestled into the side of the mountain as if it had grown there. A plume of long-dead smoke stained the stone chimney. Abandoned. A gift from the goddess. With the last of her strength, she pushed open the heavy door and collapsed inside, shoving a rusted iron bar into place to secure it. The air was thick with the scent of cold ash, old leather, and something else. Something clean and wild, like snowmelt and pine. She was safe. For now. The first day was a blur of exhaustion. She found a small store of dried meat and hard biscuits, a tin of coffee beans, and a stack of wool blankets in a cedar chest. She ate sparingly, drank from a hand pump in the corner that drew up shockingly cold sweet water, and slept. She slept the deep, dreamless sleep of the hunted, her body finally succumbing to its limits. The second day, a fragile sense of calm began to settle in her bones. She explored the small cabin. It was masculine and sparse. A single bed, a heavy oak table, 2 chairs. A collection of well-honed knives lay in a leather roll on the mantelpiece. A bookshelf held not novels but tomes on animal husbandry, cartography, and ancient pack laws. This was not the hovel of a hermit. It was the retreat of a man of purpose. But he was gone, and she was here, and that was all that mattered. She spent the afternoon mending the tears in her dress with a needle and thread she found in a small tin, her small, competent stitches a quiet act of defiance against the chaos of her escape. On the third day, the world ended. She was sitting at the table, grinding a few coffee beans with the back of a spoon, when the sound came. A heavy, deliberate footstep on the porch. Then another. She froze, her heart leaping into her throat. It couldn't be Brannock. His hunters were loud, crashing through the woods with boorish arrogance. This was silent, precise. The iron bar on the door lifted, with a quiet scrape of metal on wood, manipulated from the outside with an ease that spoke of impossible strength. The door swung inward, and the Alpha King walked in. Ilara knew him only by reputation and the few stark portraits that hung in the elders' halls. Kalen, the Wolf of the North, ruler of all 7 packs. He was larger than the stories told, a monolith of a man who filled the doorway blocking out the light. His hair was the color of a winter night, his eyes a startling pale gray, like a frozen lake. He wore simple black leather, functional and unadorned, but power rolled off him in palpable waves, a silent, crushing pressure that made the very air in the cabin grow thick and heavy. He didn't look surprised. His gaze swept over her, a quick, assessing glance that took in her mended dress, her bare feet, the spoon in her hand. He looked at the half-empty packet of biscuits on the table, the neatly folded blanket on the chair where she'd slept. His face was a mask of cold neutrality. There was no anger, no shock, just observation. This was it. Her life was forfeit. She was trespassing on the king's private land, a runaway Omega who had defied her Alpha. The punishment would be death, or a fate so much worse, being handed back to Brannock in chains. Her entire body locked in terror, a scream trapped behind her teeth. The king's pale eyes met hers for a single, long moment. Then he broke contact, his attention moving to the cold hearth. He walked past her, his presence a physical force that made the hairs on her arms stand up. He knelt, and with an economy of motion, arranged the kindling and logs she'd gathered. A spark from a flint, a soft breath, and a small flame flickered to life. He rose, moved to the counter where she'd been working, and took the tin of coffee beans from her nerveless fingers. He didn't speak. He ground the beans in a small, efficient hand mill, filled a pot with water from the pump, and set it on a hook over the burgeoning fire. The silence stretched, thick with her terror and his unnerving calm. She remained frozen at the table, a statue of a girl waiting for the axe to fall. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the gentle bubbling of the water. When the coffee was brewed, its rich, dark scent filling the small space, he poured the liquid into 2 tin mugs. He walked to the table, placed one mug in front of her, and sat down in the other chair. He cradled his own mug in his large, scarred hands, the steam wreathing a face that gave away nothing. He didn't speak. He didn't threaten. He just sat there, drinking his coffee, as if finding a strange woman in his private, isolated sanctuary was the most normal thing in the world. And in his silence, in his calm, was a threat more profound than any angry roar could ever be. He was the king. He had all the time in the world. And she was trapped. Chapter 2. Time ceased to have meaning. Hours bled into one another, marked only by the shifting light outside the single window and the slow, deliberate movements of the king. Ilara remained at the table, the coffee he'd poured for her long gone cold. She hadn't touched it. Every nerve in her body was screaming at her to run, but there was nowhere to go. The king was a physical barrier, a mountain of silent authority she could not hope to bypass. He finished his coffee, rinsed the mug at the pump, and placed it neatly on a shelf. Then he picked up a well-oiled rifle that had been leaning in the corner and, without a word or a backward glance, walked out of the cabin, shutting the door softly behind him. She was alone. The release of tension was so abrupt, it made her dizzy. She gasped for air she hadn't realized she'd been holding. He was gone. He'd left her. Was he going for guards? Was he simply allowing her a few moments of peace before her execution? Her mind, frantic and skittish, supplied a dozen terrifying possibilities. But as the minutes stretched into an hour, and then 2, a different kind of anxiety began to set in. The simple fact was, he had left her here, unbound, unguarded. He could have dragged her out, thrown her over his shoulder, chained her to a post. He had done none of those things. He had made her coffee. The sheer absurdity of it was disorienting. She finally stood, her legs stiff and shaky, and moved around the small space. Her eyes fell on the bookshelf. The books were old, their leather covers worn smooth with use. She pulled one out. The lunar cycle and its effect on predatory instincts. Another was a detailed atlas of the northern territories, its maps meticulously annotated in a sharp, precise hand. This was a place of study, of quiet contemplation. It didn't feel like the lair of a tyrant. Late in the afternoon, he returned. He carried 2 plump rabbits, cleaned and skinned with practiced ease. He still didn't speak to her. He moved to the hearth, stoked the fire, and began to cook the meat on a spit, the scent of roasting game filling the cabin. Ilara retreated to the chair in the corner, pulling one of the wool blankets around her shoulders, trying to make herself as small and unnoticeable as possible. She watched him, mesmerized by the fluid grace of his movements. For a man so large, he was possessed of a startling quietness. He was not a brute like Brannick, who crashed through life with loud demands and careless gestures. The king was deliberate. Every action had a purpose. When the rabbits were cooked, he carved the meat with one of the sharp knives from the mantel. He placed a generous portion on a wooden plate, along with one of the remaining biscuits, and set it on the floor, a few feet from her chair. He then sat at the table and ate his own meal, his back partially to her. It was the way one would feed a frightened animal. Her stomach growled, a traitorous sound in the quiet room. She hadn't eaten since the previous day. Humiliation warred with a desperate, gnawing hunger. He was treating her like a stray dog, but a dog he was, For some inexplicable reason, feeding. Hesitantly, she reached for the plate. The meat was tender and perfectly cooked. She ate quickly, her eyes darting between her food and the solid wall of his back. He gave no indication that he was watching her, but she felt his awareness like a physical touch. This became their pattern. For the next 2 days, they lived in a shared silence that was more intimate than any conversation. He would leave in the mornings to hunt or scout the territory, she never knew which. He always returned with food. He would cook, they would eat, and he would spend the evenings reading by the fire while she remained in her corner, a ghost in his home. She began to notice things, small details that didn't fit with the terrifying legend of the Alpha King. He was meticulously neat, cleaning every dish and tool after he used it. He moved with a hunter's stealth, but there was no menace in his quiet. And he watched her. She would catch it sometimes, a flicker of his pale gray eyes in her direction when he thought she wasn't looking. It wasn't a lecherous gaze, not like the way Brannick and his men looked at her. It was analytical. He was studying her, and she had no idea what he was looking for. On the 5th day of her strange captivity, it happened. A flash of blue, a sickening thud against the windowpane. A small mountain bluebird, stunned, fell to the porch outside. Without thinking, Ilara was on her feet. The door was no longer a barrier to her, but an exit. She rushed outside, the cold boards of the porch shocking her bare feet. The tiny bird lay on its side, a wing bent at an unnatural angle, its chest rising and falling in shallow, panicked twitches. A wave of pure empathy washed over her. It was the familiar connection she'd always felt, the silent language she shared with the wild things. Her pack had called it a worthless trait, a silly, sentimental weakness in an Omega who should be focused on more practical matters. But to her, it was the only part of herself that felt real. She knelt, her hands hovering over the frightened creature. "Shh, little one," she murmured, her voice soft and low. "You're all right. I'm not going to hurt you." She gently scooped the bird into her cupped hands. It trembled violently, its tiny heart a frantic drum against her palm. She focused, pushing aside her own fear and uncertainty, and extended that thread of calm she knew how to weave. She didn't know how it worked, only that it did. The frantic energy of the creature began to subside, its trembling lessening as it absorbed the tranquility she offered. Its beady black eyes stared up at her, no longer wild with terror. Carefully, she examined the wing. A clean break. With an instinct she couldn't explain, she knew what to do. Holding the bird securely in one hand, she used the fingers of the other to gently, firmly set the delicate bone. The bird let out a tiny peep of pain, but it didn't struggle. She found a strip of bark from a birch tree and, using a thread she pulled from the hem of her worn dress, fashioned a minuscule splint, securing the wing against its body. She sat there on the porch for a long time, cradling the bird, murmuring to it, sharing her warmth and her strange, quiet energy until its breathing was deep and even. She was so absorbed in her task that she didn't hear him approach. "What are you doing?" The voice was a low rumble directly behind her. She jumped, nearly dropping the bird. The king stood in the doorway, his massive frame eclipsing the light. His face held that same, unreadable expression, but his eyes were fixed on the small, feathered bundle in her hands. It flew into the window," she stammered, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Its wing was broken. I was just helping it." He knelt beside her, his proximity overwhelming. He was so close, she could feel the heat radiating from his body, smell the scent of pine and cold mountain air that clung to him. He didn't look at her. He looked at the bird. He extended a large calloused finger, moving with incredible slowness, and gently stroked the top of the bird's head. The creature, which should have been terrified, leaned into his touch. His pale eyes lifted from the bird to meet hers. For the first time, she saw something other than cold neutrality in their depths. It was a flicker of intense curiosity, a spark of something she couldn't name. "You have a healer's touch," he stated. It wasn't a compliment, it was a simple declaration of fact. "My pack, they said it was a foolishness," she whispered, the old shame stinging her. "Your pack is led by a fool," he replied, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. But the words themselves were a shield, an unexpected defense that left her speechless. He stood, his shadow falling over her once more. "Bring it inside. A storm is coming." He was right. The sky to the west was bruised and purple, the wind beginning to keen through the high pines. That night, the storm broke with a fury. Wind and rain lashed against the small cabin, and the world outside disappeared into a roaring chaos of blackness and water. The fire in the hearth was their only anchor, a warm, golden bubble against the tempest. The threat of Brannock's hunters seemed distant, replaced by the more immediate, primal power of the storm. The temperature in the cabin dropped. Elara, cradling the sleeping bird in a small box lined with wool, began to shiver. Kalen noticed. He rose from his chair and retrieved the heaviest of the blankets, a thick, dark fur pelt. He didn't throw it at her, He walked over and deliberately, carefully, draped it over her shoulders. His fingers brushed the back of her neck, a brief, startling touch that sent a jolt of heat through her entire body. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. He merely nodded, returning to his seat by the fire. The space between them felt different now, charged with a new kind of tension. It wasn't fear anymore. It was awareness, a dizzying, terrifying awareness of him as a man, not just a king. An hour passed in the roaring silence. The bird was safe. She was warm, but the king looked weary. A deep line was etched between his brows as he stared into the flames. Acting on an impulse she didn't fully understand, she stood up. "I can make some tea," she offered quietly. "I saw some herbs in one of the tins. Willow bark and chamomile. It's good for aches and for rest." He looked up, his gray eyes meeting hers in the flickering firelight. He seemed to consider her for a long moment, his gaze so intense it felt as if he were seeing straight through to her soul. Finally, he gave a single, slow nod. Her hands trembled slightly as she prepared the tea, steeping the dried herbs in hot water from the kettle. It was a simple, domestic act, yet it felt monumental. She was serving the Alpha King, not as a thrall or a servant, but as an equal? No, that wasn't right. But it was something other than a prisoner. She brought the steaming mug to him. He took it from her, his fingers brushing against hers. This time, the contact was electric, a spark that made her draw her hand back as if burned. She retreated to her own chair, pulling the heavy pelt tighter around her. He drank the tea, his eyes never leaving the fire. "Why haven't you sent me back?" The question tumbled out of her, quiet and fragile in the storm-tossed night. She had to know. The uncertainty was a worse torture than any punishment. He lowered his mug, his gaze still fixed on the flames. The firelight carved harsh shadows across the planes of his face. "I was at your pack's gathering," he said, his voice a low, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate in her very bones. "An official visit. I was in the gallery observing." Ilara's blood ran cold. He had been there. He had seen everything. The declaration, her refusal, the humiliation, the laughter. "I saw Brannock attempt to claim you by force," he continued, his tone devoid of judgment, a simple recounting of events. "And I saw you refuse. Then I saw you run." He turned his head then, and his pale, penetrating eyes met hers. "He does not deserve a mate who is his superior in courage." The breath left her body in a rush. Superior in courage. No one had ever used such a word to describe her. She was Ilara the Quiet, Ilara the Omega, Ilara, the foolish girl who preferred the company of animals to her own kind. "You knew I was here," she whispered, the pieces clicking into place. "When you arrived, you weren't surprised." "This mountain is my land," he stated simply. "I am aware of everything that draws breath upon it. I knew the moment you crossed the boundary. I let you be. I wanted to see what you would do." He had been watching her, testing her. For what? She couldn't begin to imagine. "Brannock is a fool," he said again, his voice dropping lower, laced with a cold anger that was more frightening than any shout. "He believes strength is found in noise and brute force. He tried to claim what was not his in defiance of the old law. A mate cannot be taken. A mate must be chosen. By both." He looked at her, and the cold mask was gone, replaced by an expression of raw, unguarded intensity. He saw a possession to be broken, a prize to be won. His gaze dropped to her hands, which were resting on the sleeping bird's box. "He never saw you at all." In that moment, under the weight of his words, the last of her fear dissolved, replaced by a feeling so new and overwhelming she couldn't name it. He saw her. The Alpha King, the most powerful wolf in the world, the man feared by all, looked at her and saw not an Omega, not a runaway, not a problem to be solved, but her, just Ilara. And in his eyes, she was not small at all. Chapter 3. The storm passed, leaving the world scoured clean and silent. The air in the cabin had changed too. The oppressive tension was gone, replaced by a quiet hum of understanding. They spoke more after that night. Not about anything of consequence, but small things. She asked him about the books, and he told her of his travels to the lands described within them. He asked her about the herbs she knew, and he listened, truly listened, as she explained their properties, a knowledge passed down from a grandmother her pack had also dismissed as eccentric. He never asked about Brannock. He never asked what her life had been like. It was as if he understood that the past was a wound, and he was content to let it heal on its own time. On the third day after the storm, she released the bluebird. She had removed the splint that morning, and the wing was strong. She carried it outside, the king standing a respectful distance away, watching. She opened her hands. The bird hesitated for a second, looking up at her, then launched itself into the crisp morning air, chirping a triumphant song as it soared into the pines. A pang of loss, sharp and sweet, went through her. "You healed it," Kaelin said from behind her. "It healed itself," she replied, turning to face him. "I just gave it a safe place to do so." His eyes held hers, and she knew they weren't talking about the bird anymore. The peace was shattered that afternoon. It began with a scent on the wind, something foul and aggressive that made the hair on Ilara's neck stand on end. Kalen, who had been sharpening a knife by the fire, went utterly still. He lifted his head, nostrils flaring, and a low, dangerous growl rumbled in his chest. It was the first truly wolf-like sound she had ever heard him make, and it was terrifying. "Stay inside," he commanded, his voice flat and cold as steel. "Bar the door behind me. Do not open it for anyone." He picked up the heavy rifle, his movements economical and deadly, and was gone. Ilara rushed to obey, her hands fumbling with the iron bar. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She knew who it was. Brannick. He had found her. She peered through a small crack in the window shutters. The clearing in front of the cabin was filled with wolves, 5 of them in their human forms, flanking a furious-looking Brannick. They were armed, their posture arrogant and invasive. They had trespassed on the king's land, a crime punishable by death. They were either incredibly stupid or dangerously desperate. Brannick radiated a possessive rage. "Kalen," he bellowed, his voice echoing unnaturally in the quiet woods. "I know you're in there, and I know you have what belongs to me. Send out my mate." My mate. The words were a brand, searing her with a shame she didn't deserve. Kalen emerged from the dense woods to their left, not from the cabin. He moved with a liquid silence that was utterly at odds with his size, the rifle held loosely at his side. He wasn't aiming it. He didn't need to. His presence was a more potent weapon than any firearm. "Brannick," Kalen's voice was deceptively calm, yet it cut through the clearing like a shard of ice. "You are trespassing. You and your curs have one chance to turn around and leave my territory." Brannick laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "I'm not leaving without my property. That Omega bitch humiliated me. She belongs to the Black River Pack, and I am its alpha. You have no right to interfere." "Rights are not determined by the volume of your voice," Kalen said, taking a slow, deliberate step forward. He stopped in the center of the clearing, a king holding court in his domain. "She is not your property. She is not your mate. She refused you. That is her right, under the oldest of laws. Laws you seem to have forgotten." Ilara pressed her hand to her mouth, her breath catching in her throat. He was defending her, not just hiding her, but publicly, unequivocally defending her right to choose. "The law is for the strong," Brannick spat, his face contorting with fury. "She is a weak, worthless Omega. She has no rights. She has no choice. Now give her to me, or we will take her." Kalen's expression didn't change, but a palpable cold emanated from him, a stillness that was more menacing than any snarl. Ilara could feel the pressure of his power even through the thick log walls of the cabin. "You have come all this way for a woman you deem worthless," Kalen stated, his voice carrying to every corner of the clearing. His pale eyes swept over Brannick and his men with utter contempt. "You have broken sacred law, trespassed on royal land, and threatened your king, all because your pride was wounded by a female you yourself claim has no value." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. The other wolves began to shift uncomfortably. "You are a fool, Brannick," Kalen continued, his voice dropping to a low, lethal tone. "You looked at her and saw an object for your convenience, a vessel for your heirs, a thing to be owned." He turned his head then, his gaze finding the window where he knew she was watching. His eyes locked with hers, and the entire world seemed to fall away. There was no one else in the clearing, no one else in the world, just him and her. "I look at her," he said, his voice ringing with an absolute, unshakable certainty that vibrated through the very wood of the cabin. "And I see a queen." The declaration